Nina is going to talk about a study about speech perception of Mandarin lexical tones and the relationship of it with musical experience.
Hi everybody, I'm Nina. I'm a final year student studying BA Linguistic International program, which means last year I stayed in Germany for a year abroad. And my main interest in linguistic is phonetics, phonology, speech science, and their application in language acquisition, I think. And that's also what you will be seeing in my long essay project, which is something I'm going to be talking about today. The title of my project is Do They Hear Music? Investigating the effect of musical experiences on the categorization of Mandarin lexical tones by non-native listeners. And before we dive into this project, I think I do want to familiarize us with some key concepts. Pitch and fundamental frequency. So in the hearing process, when we hear a sound, a sound signal or sound stream, I think from my study in linguistics, I always mixed up these two terms for a really long time. Pitch is a perceptual term, whereas fundamental frequency is what is really existing for the sound signals. It is the frequency of pulses produced by vibration of the sound-making systems. And signals could be different in fundamental frequency, but may not necessarily result in perception of pitch differences. On the other side, note that in the current slide, we have the speech signals. So pitch can be both a property of speech or non-speech signals, and this slide shows the speech signals of this pitch processing process. And we can see that this is also really very, very important for the current study because the pitch variations realized in speech signals that is used by some tone languages to distinguish word meanings are called lexical tones, which is what I used in the title of this project. And then, for example, the famous 4 ma productions in Mandarin. I'll do a demonstration now. So ma, 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 ma. You can see with the different perceived pitch realizing in tones, the 4 utterances of ma can be interpreted in 4 different meanings. And at the same time, pitch variations can be heard as non-speech signals like music. So when playing 2 different keys of A's on piano, when you're playing piano, the higher and the lower pitches we heard are created by the difference in frequencies as well, with the higher A having a doubled amount of vibrations in the sound wave compared to the lower A. So that's why my first thought is that it might be possible that tone languages could sound like singing music to non-native listeners, considering the similar vocal folds manipulation involved in the production processes. And in fact, many studies have already shown that the possibility to transfer musical pitch processing skills to lexical tone perception in language, and also demonstrated that non-native listeners who are musicians or had more musical training can actually identify and discriminate tone variations better than non-musicians. And these are, I listed the studies down there. They have quite similar study design, so I'm not going to go into details about them. But a major thing about these studies is that only the 3-letter ones in the second group investigated a particular kind of musical experiences, like melodic proficiency or musical training time. And we can see that most studies under this topic were still trying to focus on proving an effect rather than tackle what is really happening in this black box. So I wanted to investigate into detail within this facilitation system, like how did non-native listeners process unfamiliar lexical tones and what difference could the extra music ability make? And this aim is achieved by a particular experimental design inspired by the 2014 studies of Zhou and Best. The situation for how non-native listeners could perceive the lexical tones is that really there were a few proposals. The first one listed here, the Zhou and Best 2008 and 2014 studies, they proposed a categorical perception. So they found that intonation patterns could be used by English and French speakers to assimilate non-native Mandarin tones. These participants perceived tone 1 as flat pitch, tone 2 as question, tone 4 as statement, with the difference among mean assimilation percentages being significant for these 3 tones. And that's for Zhou and Best. Another assumption is that made by Huang was based on the sensitivity of non-native listeners to pitch levels, but not pitch contours or directions. So to illustrate, when they hear a pair of rising tone and high level tone, which is like tone 3, 5, 3 is the onset and 5 is the offset, and high level is tone 5, 5, and compared to another pair of tones, a rising tone and a high falling tone. So I will demonstrate this two pair. The first pair, ma, ma. The second pair, ma, ma. This will be particularly difficult to discriminate because the onset and offset points are all the same except the ending tone offsets 5 and 1. And what is really important here is that Chen et al. In 1975 actually found native tone language speakers perceive tones categorically. So I decided to use the categorization task designed by Zhou and Best in their 2014 study, and they originally used native intonation categories as response conditions. And I added the pitch contour categories as another set of response condition for my experiment. I'll show you. Here is a summary of all the response labels I used for my experiment. You can see there are 3 conditions: intonation types, pitch contour symbols, and music notations. I added this extra music notation condition because I want to directly testify the effect of musical experiences. Technically, we can do that with the pitch contour symbols, but I was just thinking with the music notations, you can maximize the likelihood for participants to really use their music ability. That's why I had them. These notations were tones transcribed into percussion notations. Percussion notations are these like little crosses, notes on the stave sheets design. The thing is, you can see here that these musical notations look really similar to pitch contour symbols, and that will be that was problematic for my experiment. I'll be explaining it later. Okay, let's quickly go through the methods part so that we can come back to categorization task later. So for the experiment, I recruited 39 participants, but then discarded 1 because of the inappropriate completion of a task. I recruited these people from Facebook and UCL Psychology Subject Pool. Really convenient tool. Highly recommend you guys to do it as well. And these adults are all above 18-year-old, and they had no knowledge of tone languages or history of speech or hearing impairment. And for the experiment that was created and carried out on Gorilla Experiment Builder, the data was collected between beginning of February to mid-March. And then for categorization task specifically, headphones wearing was instructed to ensure the quality of the audio stimuli. So because I'm going to be describing the procedure of the experiments, I think it will be difficult to imagine what it is like. So I put the link, I will put the link here. If you want to click into it and then kind of try it, you could. You can log in with your initials or name, whatever. This is a pilot mode of recruiting, so it's fine. So for the categorization task, the stimuli used were produced by 3 native speakers, and some best tokens were chosen and processed through Pratt for using in this experiment. And in total, each participant did 4 practice trials and 144 test trials. That's a lot because there were repetitions of the stimuli, and also for each of the response condition, they need to do all these 3 tokens of 4 tones. So that was quite a lot. And the order of the response of the conditions and audio tokens were randomized. And then that was just the categorization task. The second task of the experiment is Gold-MSI questionnaire, which is a psychometric tool for assessing self-reported musical skills and behaviors. So with the questionnaire format, they can just answer these questions, and then I'll collect the answer. And there were you can download a scoring sheet from the official website, and then the scores will be automatically calculated. And that way I could measure the musical experiences into like numbers, so I could use it for statistical analysis. And the scores I got ranged from 57 to 98 out of 100 for total score. and I did a median split on 82, which is above. If the people scored above 82, I'll consider them as musicians, musicians. And I had 18 of them, and the other group had 20 people who scored under 82 in the Gold-MSI scores. And then with this musicianship, I did a repeated measures ANOVA to try to investigate whether musicians performed better than non-musicians in the categorization task, and whether this was affected by response condition. So response conditions was a within subject variable, and only weak effect of response condition was found. But for the followed up pair t-test, there was no difference really between the pair of conditions. And sadly and surprisingly, no effect was found for musical experiences. And to try to make sense of the findings, I also looked into the confusion patterns as well. Averages of correct responses for each tone by condition were calculated. And here you can see in general, percentage correct for each tone ranged from 34% around that and to 70%. That is all above 25% chance rate, which is a good thing because this means the results are valid. And for a specific condition, let's look into intonation conditions. You can see these are not really working because they are all kind of lower than the average. I don't think you guys can see my mouse. So I'll have to kind of talk you through. Anyway, but then specifically for this condition, you can see only flat pitch, which is this blue thing for tone 1, and question for tone 2 worked-ish. And then the statement and exclamation, which is for tone 3 and tone 4, didn't really work because they're really low. And then let's move to pitch contours. You can see here that tone 3 was the corresponding tilted kind of symbol. Maybe I'll show you guys later if you need to recap on the response labels images. But tone 3 was assimilated exceptionally well. That is higher than all different conditions performances, as with the gray bar, 62.94%. And for musical notations, all the percentage correct are above average. So in general, they worked for assimilation. And then I separated the confusion patterns by musical experiences. We can see here from the mean scores that the patterns were mostly the same for the two groups, and consistent with the indication of pair t-test result, which I didn't really show you guys because they were non-significant, but they kind of showed a bit like p equals 0.06 and 0.08, that kind of, it's not effective, but weak effect on the tone identification accuracy. And the biggest distinction here between two groups are also the low accuracy rate of tone 3 and tone 4 in the intonation accuracy for musicians. This suggests that intonation types, especially statement and exclamation categories, were less acceptable for musicians to assimilate to, consider their better listening skills. They could be more sensitive to mismatches. That doesn't necessarily mean that they performed less well, it's just they are more sensitive to the mismatch, so they couldn't really just assimilate that, accept that as the non-musicians. And let's move on to discussions. So we can see there was no effect of musical experiences. And the first and most straightforward reason is that musical experience measurement used in this research is different from the previous studies, which all kind of showed advantages and positivity. But for this study, which is tested by Gold-MSI, the musicians might not be as musical as the ones in the previous studies because the classification, the kind of assessment is different. What considered here by Gold-MSI might not be the other stuff that the other assessment tools that's used in the other studies. But then Gold-MSI scores were actually composed of 5 subscales: active engagement, musical training, perceptual abilities, singing abilities, and emotions. It might be the case that not all 5 factors are targeting at the tone perception. So maybe if we are repeating this experiment for more to see more effect, then maybe we could try to use only perceptual abilities and musical training as the factor to get the musical experience score. Maybe that will show a better ANOVA result. And another thing is that this measurement tool is self-reported, so that could be affected by a lot of factors amongst the participants, like different levels of self-awareness in the music domain, the inappropriate frame of comparison, any biases introduced by social desirability, extreme levels of self-confidence, or other personality traits. So a lot of factors can mess up with the results. And as I kind of mentioned before, the response category mismatches is also another thing. The tone 3 and tone 4 in the international categories just make the performance worse. And then the music notations, the kind of percussion notes were too similar, even though it's kind of it's a different condition, but it's kind of too similar, looking too similar to the pitch contour symbols. So it may not be working its way, like targeting directly at the musical experiences. I think that will be definitely to be worked on, to like find a better design or what to make sure that it's function as what it's supposed to be doing. So yeah, that's what about saying about the music notations. It's kind of problematic, but it's at the pilot stage. So and the last point of the discussion is that although there were problems in the setting of specific categories for the response conditions, the confusion patterns discovered in current studies suggested the combination of the best examples from different modes of listening might be better to use or easier for non-native listeners to use to perceive lexical tone differences. We can see here on this graph the question intonation type, which is like when you are asking question, is this a question? That thing match the tone 2, which is a rising tone, ma, better, and it shows in this graph. And more complex contour tones like tone 3 is mostly interpretable with pitch contour symbols. And level tones, tone 1, the two highlighted blue bars here, they could be interpreted by either pitch contours or music notations. But then these fitted categorization types would be potentially beneficial to second language learning if the teachers can give the listeners some like good examples and then try to make them understand. This will be easier for them to understand the difference, I think. And that's my findings from this research.
Thank you.